I'm Mike Barthel, and this is Risk Work News. Today's guest is an industrial control system security expert with 30 plus years of experience in the areas of water and wastewater utility. He's an expert in SCADA systems, a PE by trade, and he has his Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the show, Jacob Brodsky.
Yeah.
Hey, Jake, how are you today?
Having a good time at home.
Yes, I think we all are. So, hey, we've actually got something to talk about, a current event. A current event that I'd love to get your opinion on, and I'm sure all the viewers would love to hear your take on this. But back on, it was last Friday, February 5th, an attacker, a so-called attacker, I guess, accessed a water treatment system in Florida by using a manual approach and actually taking the remote control of the mouse to manipulate the SCADA system. And I know we briefly have spoken about this, but I want to get your take on this. So what do you know about this, and what have you heard so far?
Well, let's start with a very important piece of information. Had the operator not been there to see the mouse move and noticed that somebody had accessed the system, they would have just assumed that somehow somebody fat-fingered in the wrong number on the sodium hydroxide feed rate, and they probably would have said, "Oh, okay, we'll put this aside and just correct the number and see what the pH is." And maybe if it had been sitting like that for any length of time, they probably would want to get rid of that water. But it's not an urgent thing. It's mixing in with a lot of other better water, so they may not even have to adjust things all that much. So we would never have heard about it. They would not have called the police. The only reason we know about this is because they did see it and they called the police, and that led to the public announcement the following Monday.
Well, it sounds like would this be sort of a similar case to the Ukrainian energy attack that happened in 15?
No, this doesn't even come to the same degree, because
Okay.
this is actually this is not a sophisticated attempt by anybody. This is a script kiddie move. Somebody looks at this and they might not even know what they're tweaking.
Right.
I get the feeling that somebody was just poking around, having just a little bit of sport, trying to see what they could get away with.
I see. So you don't think it was like an attacker that was really trying to do any harm? You think it was maybe just kind of a prank or something?
I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't really know who was behind the keyboard or what their motives were. And I don't expect to be hearing anything much, because the police are in an investigation, so they're not going to tell us any more than we really need to know.
Right.
And that's the unfortunate situation here. We're operating largely in the dark. There are bits and pieces of information getting out that are not surprising, but it is what it is. We're stuck between a rock and a hard place. We do want to prosecute whoever did this if they had any ill will. Right. And we definitely want to go after them. So I think at this point, we'll just have to sit tight and wait. We can afford to do that.
Well, one of the things that's kind of interesting is when you and I did a podcast back in May, we talked about IT OT convergence and just the relationship between the two groups. How do you I guess characterize this situation in those terms, I guess?
Okay, in the land of IT and OT convergence, this SCADA system was sitting on the IT network. Not that I don't even know if they have an IT department. They might have one guy that does IT. This is not a large water utility. In fact, at 15,000 people, it just barely meets the criteria for being a medium-sized water utility. Medium-sized water utilities serve populations of 10,000 and up to about 100,000. And so that puts this at the bottom of the medium list, according to the US EPA Safe Drinking Water Act.
Okay.
So you have to keep this in mind. If I would be willing to bet that there probably aren't even a dozen people working on that water utility. And as such, they're probably contracting the IT out. I'm making that up, but it's not uncommon. You go to medium to small water utilities, and that's usually what you see if they have any IT at all. So this is what you would call a converged system. And because it's converged, it means everything's in the same pile. And of course you put TeamViewer on your PC. Yeah, I mean that's because, I need people to remote in. So, and that's just it. They're so small they can't afford an engineer. They can't afford a controls engineer. They can't afford all the other people that you'd normally have in a larger utility. So they have to have people able to remote in and dial up because they don't have the budget to do anything else. This is a low budget utility. And this is one of the key things I need to hit home. Remote access is what people do when they don't have much of a budget. And so, yeah, they had somebody come, they probably had people coming in all the time to do observations and maybe a tweak or an adjustment here and there. And it probably was done that way rather than having to bring somebody on site, because if they did that, then the people coming in on site would charge you more because they're spending more time and they're spending their money to travel there.
So would you say it's a pretty kind of a simplistic attack, or pretty, it comes down to, some awareness, obviously, but how easy of an attack, how easy would this be to do?
If you guessed the password, you could do this attack. It's literally that easy. And they had the same password. They had only one account. It was in use everywhere. Only God knows where the hell they got that password. I really don't know.
Right. And so the team, talk about the team viewer. I know for the audience who's not familiar with that, but talk about that a little bit. And is that pretty common? I mean, that kind of, for a smaller type of facility like this, that they would use something like that?
I would bet that TeamViewer was used because TeamViewer was what the city was using. A lot of people would use PC Anywhere, or they would use a VPN, or they'd use RDP. They have all kinds of choices to make. I'm willing to bet that TeamViewer was just something that they had on hand, and that's what they used. If you've got an extra license for it, run with it.
Right. And we've talked before how sometimes sensitive and, vulnerable devices are actually, you can find them on the internet. I mean, is this something where, is it pretty common for like the management of a company to allow this kind of stuff to be, floating on the internet or accessible like that?
I'm willing to bet the management didn't even know that this was a bad thing to have on the internet.
Right.
I'm willing to bet that the engineering firm itself probably didn't know that this was a bad thing to have on the internet.
Right.
If they knew, they probably would have taken extra steps, because truthfully, the extra steps don't cost a whole lot. There is open VPN options that you can get on the internet for next to nothing. And you can set up your own private VPN with pre-shared keys, and that's it. That's all you need. And, okay, you limit where the thing can be accessed from. Well, that's not so bad. And you can even set up a short script for not a whole lot of, for the amount of time it takes for somebody to set up a script and then put a button on a screen is not that big. You're talking about a couple hours worth of work. And, bill them at $100 an hour, or $200 an hour. Okay, how much is that? And compared to what they've risked now, if you think that the security was expensive, well, here's what happens when you don't secure. And this ought to be a wake-up call for a lot of water utilities, because all the medium and small size water utilities have this problem. They're all doing this.
Right. And you said earlier that when we talked before the podcast, that the state of Massachusetts had come out with some interesting information on this stuff.
Yeah, it's funny. The feds didn't say very much. But the state of Massachusetts actually had some useful information, and in fact, I highlighted some of it on one of my screens. Hang on, I'm looking now.
Okay.
I'm quoting from the service details, a cybersecurity advisor for public water suppliers from Massachusetts. It said, all computers used by water plant personnel were connected to the SCADA system and used the 32-bit version of Windows 7 operating system. Further, all computers shared the same password for remote access and appeared to be connected directly to the internet without any type of firewall protection installed. Okay, there's your, that if that isn't a great big kick me sign, I don't know what is.
Right.
That's the kind of thing you find with Shodan.
Right, and we talked about Shodan a little in our last podcast. Can you kind of refresh the audience a little bit about your experience with Shodan and how the projects that you worked on?
gosh, this is going back a few years now. When Shodan first showed up, I think within 6 months, Bob Radvanovsky and I were both looking at search engines, and we were going to use search engines with certain keywords that we were going to use to find industrial control assets. And then we discovered Shodan that doesn't just look on the web, it looks using HTTP. It used Telnet, it used a couple other interesting FTP, I think even SNMP at the time. So we saw, hey, this is good, we'll go for it, and we went after it. We started scraping Shodan to go look for industrial control systems. Bob put a tremendous amount of work into this, and this was before Shodan was configured to go look for any of this. So we went looking, and we were expecting at some point while the spiders from Shodan were gathering information, we were expecting at some point the rate was going to drop off. Only the problem is we kept discovering new stuff, and by the time we got to about 1 million hits, we started to get nervous because we had a lot of information there that could be used against a lot of people, and we didn't really want to have that. We had the IP addresses basically from all these searches. Now, we tried to look them up, and what you tend to get is an ISP. You go to the ISP and you say, hey, can I find out what this IP address goes to? They're not going to tell you, because really that's not, they're trying to keep their customer list private. And so we never really got very far with that. We just sort of had all these IP addresses with all the protocols and likely targets that we had found. And at some point we just got so nervous, we just said, hey, forget it, let's stop. Well, by then Shodan had gone out there and started scanning for a lot of these industrial protocols and for these sorts of entry search terms, and to go find all this stuff. And today there's people all over the world looking around for industrial control systems exposed to the internet. And I would bet you that if you found something right now, there's a good chance a lot of it would be a water utility.
I see. And speaking of water utilities, one thing I've read in the last couple of days, because I've tried to bone up on this a little bit myself, because it is, once it gets on the news, it is of interest, and so. But one of the things that I've heard and read is that the water utility is one of the easier critical infrastructure to get inside of. I mean, how would you compare it to like an electrical system?
The electrical guys are much more interconnected than water is, because it's feasible to do so. Water utilities tend to be very small provincial things, and they tend not to share water between them because it's just too expensive. Pipelines are expensive to lay. And they're also, water is heavy. It takes energy to move it, even if the pipeline is level. And if it has to go up and down a hill, oh, you're talking serious energy, because basically what you're doing is it's hydroelectric power backwards. So they don't tend to interconnect as much as electric utilities do. And the electric utilities sense that because they can be interconnected so well, they needed to be better protected, because if any one of them falls down, it could jeopardize others, and you could have a massive regional blackout if that happens. So, but water utilities aren't like that. If one water utility fails, well, there's others, within a short drive, and it's not usually a huge problem. Now, some cities have very large water utilities. I can think of one down in Southern California. They're huge, and they serve so many million people that if it were to have a region-wide SCADA problem, it would be international news overnight, and they wouldn't stop talking about it for quite some time.
Right. Well, it's been publicly acknowledged that this was a remote access software package, like we were talking about. And one of the things that we've spoken about before was just kind of the remote access, vulnerabilities. And I mean, I think you actually said that we need to get rid of some of the remote access stuff. And it's just, talk about that a little bit, I guess.
Okay. Larger utilities tend to have people on site in many places or close to these places. And remote access isn't as critical for them as it is for a smaller utility that might need to seek help in a hurry. So let's say you're a small water utility, you don't even have a staff engineer that understands this, the controls part of it. So you probably have a control systems vendor who serves, I'm going to guess and say a dozen different small water utilities around them. And they make a good living by doing that. And what they do is they have access, remote access into your system, because that's the only way they can manage. If they have to drive out to you every single time that there's something weird going on, they're going to waste a lot of time. You're going to waste a lot of time. You're going to spend a lot of money that you don't really have to throw at this. And there goes your reason for putting in automation in the first place, because, you know, they usually put this stuff in as a convenience rather than as a necessity. Now, the larger operations have to do it as a necessity. So for them, the equation is quite different. So for small water utilities, and just to put it in perspective, the EPA says there are about 145 public water systems in the 145,000 public water systems in the United States, of which 97% are small, according to the Safe Drinking Water Act. Small meaning less than 10,000 population served. So, you know, you have to sit back and think about that for a minute. Water utility failure, if one of them fails, it's nasty, it's not fun, but believe it or not, it happens, and you don't even hear much about it on the news. So I'm gonna point that out. You know, it's not quite the same equation as it is between water as it is in electric.
So this was a pretty simple, going back to what you said earlier. This was a kind of a simple breach or an attack. But what happens if a skilled, highly resourced adversary has administrative access to your ICS, and talk about the potential problems there?
I don't want to get into specific details of what you would break and how you would break it, because thankfully we haven't seen that.
Right.
Skilled attackers are expensive because even among software hacking and the like, once you break in, what do you do? And the answer is you don't know unless you're an engineer who really knows the systems and how to break them. So you're talking about a fairly expensive operation. You would only leverage that against a large water utility that would make a big splashy headline. And right. The only people that would really want to do that are probably nation states, because there's no money in this. There's no money in destroying somebody else's utility. At least I don't think there is. I mean, I guess there's ransomware, but ransomware works for just about everything. So why go to a utility and risk having somebody get so offended that they want to drop bombs on you? That just doesn't figure. So that's probably why we haven't seen this problem more.
One of the other things I've read lately, Jake, is that I've seen a lot of calls for updating our critical infrastructure as a nation. And I actually saw a quote out there: ICS notoriously runs on systems that are decades old. What's your response to that?
They do. And they don't see anything wrong with it because it works. And if it's not broken, they're not going to fix it. That's the mentality of most water utilities, and the infrastructure that they have is old. That's how they work. That's how they operate. And oh, by the way, they're not experts in computers, and they don't really know what the hazards are. And they're not, there's no legal mandate for them to follow along with software, so they don't. You didn't ask for it. You didn't pay for it. You didn't give them a mandate to do it. So guess what? It's still the same thing it was before, as long as it's working. So yes, guilty as charged, but not for any other reason other than that was what the customer asked for, whether they realized it or not.
So in this case, what do you think this Oldsmar town or whatever, what do you think this utility needs to do? What's next steps for them to try to fix this issue?
Well, now that they've been embarrassed, they're probably going to get an upgrade. They're due for one, if nothing else, to get them up to a current operating system and maybe a more current version of the application software. But really, most of what they needed to do has already been done. Their risk is a process risk, and they have done that well. The operator caught the problem quickly before it had any chance to even have an effect on the process, and changed the number back. It doesn't get any better than that. I mean, what do you want them to do?
Right.
So I call this a success story. Obviously, they can learn a few things from it, but it really isn't as ugly as people make it out to be. I mean, I know there's lots of keyboard warriors out there that are busy trying to make this into World War III. It's not. It never was. It's
Right.
just a very awake and aware operator doing his job. Congratulations. I deserve, if I ever find out who it was, I owe him a beer.
Right. Because it's brought it to light. I guess it's brought it to light for other companies and in the industry in general. So I guess it's probably a good thing that people are. It's just kind of a wake up call, like you said.
That's all. And by the way, this also brings up some issues with engineering. And this was, believe it or not, this actually made it into the CISA report that just came out, and they pointed this. This is great. Size your process appropriately. There is a tendency in this business to overbuild everything because civil engineers always overbuild everything. That's what they do. They want to put in extra margin and make sure it's just able to handle anything, including, zombie apocalypse, So they think about these things, and a lot of times they overspecify things. But here's a reason you don't want to do that. If you're talking about a chemical injection pump on a well, whose chemistry doesn't change very much at all, ever. I mean, stays within the same band. Get the pump sized correctly so that you can't ask for a toxic rate. Then you're done. You don't have to worry about what people plug into the control system because it can't go there from here. They put 11,000 in where 100 should be. So what? The controller will look at it and say, that's a funny number. Might go up to 200 parts per million or something like that. And then, it gives you plenty of time to catch up because, you look at it and you go, that's weird. But this would not happen if engineers pay attention to properly sizing all the control valves and all the other chemical pumping systems so that you can't turn them up to 11, basically.
I like the Spinal Tap reference.